Hi, Joe from the Velvet Review here, talking about some arrow shafts today. Victory Elite Rips. So this arrow shaft is an all-carbon shaft. I'm shooting the 350 spine myself. Just got these last week. I like to make the most out of my money. I'm a hardcore bow hunter. I'm also a blue-collar guy. So when I buy something like this, and this is a quality product, I like to make sure I'm getting my money's worth, and I'll bet a lot of you out there do too. Why I chose the Victory Rips. Number one, I like an all-carbon shaft for a couple of reasons. A couple things about my background. One, I mentioned I was a blue-collar guy. I'm a professional fishing guide for a living. I don't make a lot of money. When I buy a dozen arrows, I want them to stay straight when I pull them out of the target again and again and again and again. And I've got my 240-pound buddy yanking them out of the target. I like to know that they're going to come back straight. All-carbon shafts are very forgiving in that sense. The other part about my job is I also operate a 3D archery range at the lodge and resort where I work at, so I shoot a ton of 3D. So I put a lot of arrows out of that bow. And that, for me, having an all-carbon shaft, when I'm going to shoot that much and know that they're straight, I like to get a good value and know I'm going to get a lot of shots into a 3D target out of that arrow shaft right there. So I like an all-carbon shaft for that reason. I find them to be have the best longevity out of all things. The downsides of carbon arrow shafts have historically been the straightness tolerances. Carbon arrow shafts typically aren't as straight as the premium pure aluminum shafts or the aluminum carbon compound shafts, a hybrid shaft. That's changing. The Victory Arrow Company has these straightened down to 1/1000th of an inch. That's their Elite Series. That's their straightest arrow shaft. The other downside to carbon arrow shafts has historically been the spine. It's just not as consistent, the way they flex when they come out of your bow. And if you've never seen a slow motion video of an arrow coming out of a bow, it is amazing. That arrow undergoes massive amounts of flex and bend. So an all carbon shaft historically hasn't had the spine consistency of aluminum or aluminum carbon hybrid. That's changed as well thanks to the fact that these are spine aligned. So what that means is every carbon arrow shaft typically has one side that's weaker than another. And there's just one direction it bends that's weaker than another side. That's typical. There are a couple of different ways that shooters would find what side is weak. They would throw them in a bathtub and let them float, and whatever side was up typically was the weak side. You could put them on a spine deflection scale, and you could put them in there and determine through deduction what side is weak. Well, guess what? You don't have to go through any of that stuff. And I'll bet you 99.999% of you bow hunters out there, keyword bow hunters, you're not doing that stuff. You want to knock up, you want to spin that, put that vane where it's supposed to be on your rest, and let her fly. So the label on these where it says Elite right there, Elite 350, that right there, as long as you rotate on your knock that to the same place every time, you're going to get extremely consistent flight. The Victory Arrow Shaft Company suggests that you should rotate that to the 3 o'clock position as a right-hander, making that label face in towards the riser of your bow. So as long as you do that every time, we've kind of defeated that spine inconsistency that all carbon shafts have battled in comparison to their aluminum carbon cousins and also more expensive cousins. Because as soon as you get into the aluminum carbon hybrid game, you're spending a little bit more money on shafts. So the other upsides that I like to this, number one, this is what matters to bow hunters, is broadhead tuning, broadhead shooting really. So I've got my bow here, and we're going to take these arrows to the range tomorrow, and we're going to shoot these live, and we're going to shoot with broadheads. But number one, I really like to be able to screw my broadheads and take a dozen arrows and take a broadhead that I know to be straight and spin that broadhead and know that that thing is perfectly aligned, and I can draw it back. I've got consistent spine, and as long as my bow is paper tuned, those broadheads are going to drive into that target at the same point of impact as my field points. No messing around, no broadhead tuning, no scratching my head wondering why my broadheads are shooting 10 inches high right at 40 yards. That's what I want. I want good, consistent broadhead flight. And I think I'm going to get that out of these Victory Rip shafts just because they're super straight. Also about the outsert system, you can see it there. That's the long aluminum piece right behind the broadhead there. And there's lots of information out there online, not just Arvius. I encourage you to search around a little bit. But what I like about that is that's a 40 grain aluminum insert giving me, I haven't measured this one, but it makes my FOC fantastic. Even with just a 100 grain broadhead, my balance point is way forward on that arrow because I've got a 40 grain insert standard. Now every arrow shaft company has the option of buying some aftermarket stuff to get your inserts heavier so that you can balance FOC. These come straight 40 grains. They're nice and heavy right off the bat. You can even get a 60 grain steel upgrade if you really want to go for mega FOC. In case you're not familiar with the term FOC, that just means front of center. And typically, especially in the Western bow hunting game, when targets can be out there, we may be shooting 50, 60, 70 yards at mule deer, elk, antelope, whatever. FOC, basically, if I could explain it like this, if that broadhead, if it's falling like this and the point, say we're on a long shot, let's exaggerate a little bit, but that broadhead's falling first and I've got my weight up front, this shaft and the fletches are going to follow right behind that head as it spirals down towards the target. The more weight that I carry in the back of the shaft, the more this is going to be flopping around and affected by the wind. Think of this as your anchor. When that's falling at long range towards the target, everything else is going to follow behind. That is my anchor once it starts to fall like that. So typically, in almost every test I've ever read, greater FOCs yield better long range accuracies, especially with broadheads. So I like how that insert, it's not only 40 grains, but the weight of that insert is also way out there at the front. With hidden insert technology on some of the competitor shafts, that weight is way back here inside the shaft, and the point actually goes down and screws partially inside. That's not the case on these. We preserve all of that 100 grains on the head out front. We add another 40 right outside the edge of the shaft right there, maximizing our FOC with pretty standard gear. We don't have to start trying to find 150 grain broadheads or 75 grain brass inserts or do anything weird like that to get a fantastic FOC. Okay, so kind of in summary here, you've got spine alignment, you got massive consistency on these arrows. The rips or the Rip Elite is down to 1/1000 of an inch. My testimony is they've been the best all carbon long range accuracy shaft that I've shot yet. I've had them a week and I'm shooting better out there at 70 and 80 yards. I shoot, like I said, a ton of 3D. I fish for a living, but we happen to have a 3D course at the resort where I work. Go figure. It's perfect. I've also spun tested these, and I got 10 perfect spins out of 12. The two that don't spin, one of them happens to be right here. The two that don't spin, I mean, it is marginal. I am hunting for a wobble right there. So I'm having to search for it, but that's the biggest wobble I've got. Historically, on 1/1000 of an inch shaft, I would be lucky to get 10 that spun like that. So probably closer to 6 or 8 that spun really good, kind of to my standards. The other thing, just a note for a lot of folks, maybe there's some beginning bow hunters watching this and they're wondering, God, what's he talking about? He's spinning broadheads, he's talking about this and that. The first thing that I typically do when I get a dozen arrows like this is I'll take a broadhead that I know to be straight. It's a new broadhead. I've seen it spin straight on arrow shafts before. And I use one broadhead and I take my arrows and I just give them a flick, just on a table like that. Now there are tools and different things you can use for that. Myself and the bow hunters I run with, we're pretty regular dudes. We just take it on a table with a hard surface. You give it a flick. If it spins perfect, it's a pass. It goes in one pile. If it spins slightly imperfect, it goes in another pile. So immediately when you buy your dozen shafts, go ahead and split them into the perfect spins and the not so perfect spins. The not so perfect spins I typically use for my 3D, my field points, my practice. The perfect spins, I'll kind of set those in the dugout and wait for September. I'll screw broadheads on those because I know those are my best spinners, which those I want in my quiver kind of first up. So that's my indoor take on the Victory RIPP Elite arrow shafts. We're going to go hit the range tomorrow and field test these. So come with us and let's hop on the range.